Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about a poison. It's about the long shadow cast by a single molecule, one that reshaped medicine, fueled murder, terrified empires, and revealed the fragile architecture of the human body. For thousands of years, strychnine waited in the roots of an unassuming tree. And when humanity discovered it, lives were destroyed, societies were shaken, and history was quietly rewritten in hospital wards. Courtrooms and clandestine powders passed from hand to hand. Strychnine is not merely a toxin. It is a mirror held up to human intent. In small doses, it once promised healing. In larger doses, it delivered one of the most agonizing deaths ever documented. Its impact on history is both invisible and immense, slipping through criminal cases, scientific breakthroughs, colonial trade routes, and global pharmacology. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us tell more forgotten stories from the hidden corners of history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. Our story begins in the thick, humid forests of Southeast Asia, where the ground itself seems to breathe. Long before laboratories, before glass vials and crystalline powders, before the word strychnine existed, there was a tree. A tall, slender tree with smooth bark, oval leaves, and small clusters of orange-red berries. Local communities knew it as the poison nut tree, Strychnus nuxvomica plant that belonged to a world where survival depended on deep botanical knowledge. In the beginning, those forests were alive with texture. Cicadas humming through the wet season, the earthy smell of decaying leaves, sunlight dripping through the canopy like molten gold. To the region's indigenous peoples, the poison nut tree was not mysterious. It was simply dangerous. Its seeds were used sparingly, often as a component in arrow poisons or crushed into deadly baits meant for animals that threatened crops. These early uses didn't require chemistry. They required caution, observation, and an ancestral archive of plant lore passed from elder to apprentice. But then, something remarkable happened. People learned that even in its danger, this tree possessed power, predictable, potent, and precise. And thus began humanity's long relationship with the alkaloid that would one day be called strychnine. The first chapter of this story takes us to ancient India. The Atharva Veda, compiled around 1200 BCE, mentions seeds with properties eerily consistent with nuxvomica, bitter, punishing, capable of causing violent muscular rigidity. While scholars still debate the exact plant referenced, trade routes from the Indus region already connected to areas where the Strychnus family thrived. Ritual healers at the time experimented endlessly with bitter herbs, attempting to classify them by their effects. Some healed, some harmed. Nuxvomica belonged solidly to the latter group, but other ancient cultures also brushed against this tree's power. By the 4th century BCE, texts from early Ayurvedic practitioners, specifically those attributed to ancestry, included references to extraordinarily bitter seeds used in minuscule amounts to stimulate the body's inner fire. A poetic yet accurate description of strychnine's excitatory effects on the nervous system. These physicians lived in a world where the line between remedy and poison was thin, even thinner than we imagine. By the 2nd century BCE, Chinese healers encountered a related species, Strychnus ignatus, whose seeds known as St. Ignatius beans were traded through the Mekong corridor. In the classical medical compendium Shenong Ben Cao Jing, certain bitter seeds were classified as hot, acrid, and violently reactive, used only when diluted and only under strict supervision. Physicians knew they could spark intense bodily reactions, but they did not yet understand why. However, archaeological evidence suggests deeper, older interactions. Clay pots excavated from sites near modern-day Vietnam, dated to around 500 BC, contain residue consistent with crushed strychnus seeds. This indicates that, long before strychnine became a chemical entity, it was already woven into the rituals of hunting, conflict, and sometimes healing. For centuries, these encounters remained isolated, local, and controlled. The poison nut tree was a regional hazard, a regional tool, but history rarely allows power to remain contained. As maritime trade intensified between 500 CE and 1300 CE, the seeds began to travel farther. Arab traders navigating the Indian Ocean brought tales of the bitter nut that stiffens limbs. In the medical writings of Alkindi, the renowned 9th century polymath, there are cryptic notes describing substances that cause the muscles to lock as if in death's imitation. While he never named strychnus directly, the description aligns unmistakably with strychnine poisoning. But the seeds that carried the alkaloid were not yet the stars of scientific curiosity. They were exotic oddities, tucked into apothecary shops across Persia, Baghdad, and even Cairo as medieval physicians explored the boundaries of medicinal risk. Meanwhile, in the dense jungles of Sri Lanka, early hunters prepared a viscous poison by grinding the seeds with plant sap. When applied to aerotips, the poison produced clean, kill-swift muscular convulsions followed by respiratory collapse. The exact mechanism would not be understood for another 1,000 years. Across Southeast Asia, from Indonesia to Burma, Solé tribes cultivated intricate knowledge of strychnine plants. Hunters in Borneo mixed the seeds with extracts from other plants to create symptom-specific poisons. Some slowed the heart, others induced paralysis, and the strychnine mixture caused an unmistakable stiffening of prey before collapse. But as centuries passed, new empires rose, trade expanded, and curiosity grew. By the 1500s, European merchants began arriving in larger numbers along the coasts of India and the spice-rich islands of the Malay archipelago. They came seeking pepper, nutmeg, cloves, but their ships also carried home lesser-known botanical specimens. In this era, European apothecaries were obsessed with cataloging the exotic. Any herb, seed, or bark that promised physiological effect became a prized import. It was during one of these voyages that the seeds of Strychnine nux vomica first reached Europe. Our journey now moves to the intellectual ferment of 16th century Europe, where scholars and physicians raced to classify newly discovered plants in vast herbal compendiums. One of the earliest mentions of nux vomica in the Western world comes from the Flemish botanist Carolus Clusius, who included it in his 1574 writings. He described the seeds as exceedingly bitter and warned that they produced convulsions most violent when tested on animals. But he did not yet isolate the component responsible. By the 17th century, trade routes were transporting nux vomica seeds in small but steady quantities. Apothecaries sold them as purgatives or stimulants. Physicians used them cautiously to treat paralysis, though treatment was a generous word. The idea was simple. If the seeds could stimulate muscles into intense activity, perhaps they could reverse paralysis. In practice, this resulted in unpredictable reactions, sometimes fatal. One documented case from 1641 describes a Dutch merchant who ingested powdered nux vomica for relief from chronic fatigue. Observers noted that he first claimed renewed energy, then complained of tightening muscles, and finally collapsed into violent spasms before dying within an hour. The physicians who recorded his death were perplexed, but not shocked. Medical experimentation at the time often danced near the edge of disaster. While all this unfolded, European explorers returned again and again to Southeast Asia, sketching botanical specimens, shipping seeds to royal gardens, and attempting to understand their medicinal potential. Yet it would take another 2 centuries for the substance we now call strychnine to be isolated. By the late 1700s, the Age of Enlightenment ushered in a new obsession, discovering the chemical active principles within plants. Scientists were increasingly convinced that every medicinal plant contained a unique essence responsible for its effects. This search led to the discovery of morphine from opium, quinine from cinchona barcand, eventually strychnine from nux vomica. Our story pauses briefly here. At the threshold of chemistry, the forests of Asia had provided the raw material. Ancient physicians had observed the effects. Medieval traders had transported the seeds across continents. Early botanists had classified the tree. Now, with the Enlightenment pressing forward, the stage was set for the next chapter, one that would transform strychnine from a mysterious plant component into a purified, deadly alkaloid. But before chemistry reveals its secrets, let us step back into the sensory world of the plant itself. Picture a dry season morning in the forests near Mysore. The air is warm, carrying the sweet smell of flowering trees and the distant chatter of langur monkeys. A healer, perhaps in the 1600s, walks barefoot through the brush, approaching a nux vomica tree whose fruits have just ripened. The outer skin is yellow, leathery, about the size of a small orange. Inside lie the seeds, flat, grayish discs with a silky sheen. These seeds are bitter beyond imagination. Bitter in a way that seems almost unnatural. Bitter in a way that suggests warning, punishment, danger. Nature encodes meaning in taste, and this taste screams caution. Yet the healer collects them carefully, aware of their power. He dries them, scrapes their surface, mixes the powdered material with other herbs. A fraction of a gram may stimulate the spine, a little more may kill. This delicate balance fascinated early practitioners, long before chemistry provided explanations. And the seeds continued their journey. By the 18th century, they were sold in European markets under names like vomit nut, poison nut, and nux vomica. Physicians debated their value. Some claimed they revived failing limbs. Others believed they heightened alertness. But reports of agonizing convulsions grew more common. Strychnine was making its presence felt terrifying, unpredictable, and potent. While Europe debated, a quiet revolution was happening in France and Germany. A new generation of chemists believed that plant extracts contained pure compounds with measurable effects. The race to isolate these compounds defined early 19th century chemistry. It was within this scientific energy that strychnine finally emerged as a chemical entity. And now, With this transformation approaching, history stood at the brink of a new kind of danger, one that no earlier civilization had fully faced. The seeds would soon give up their secret, and once isolated, strychnine would escape the forests of Asia, enter pharmacies, inspire scientific marvels, and ignite some of the most chilling crimes of the modern era. But before we cross that threshold, we need to understand what made this compound so different from all other poisons. Most toxins kill quietly through sleep, through paralysis, through internal bleeding. Strychnine kills loudly, violently, with rigid muscles, locked jaws, arched backs, and seizures so fierce they fracture bones. And that is where the next stage of our story will take us. When you're ready, say, continue. And we'll move into the scientific awakening of the 1800s, when strychnine became a crystal, a weapon, a medicine, and a global obsession. Strychnine is not merely a toxin. It is a mirror held up to human intent. In small doses, it once promised healing. In larger doses, it delivered one of the most agonizing deaths ever documented. Its impact on history is both invisible and immense, slipping through criminal cases, scientific breakthroughs, colonial trade routes, and global pharmacology. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps us tell more forgotten stories from the hidden corners of history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Phone away. Distractions silenced. Our story begins in the thick, humid forests of Southeast Asia, where the ground itself seems to breathe. Long before laboratories, before glass vials and crystalline powders, before the word strychnine existed, there was a tree. A tall, slender tree with smooth bark, oval leaves, and small clusters of orange-red berries. To the region's indigenous peoples, the poison nut tree was not mysterious, it was simply dangerous. Its seeds were used sparingly, often as a component in arrow poisons or crushed into deadly baits meant for animals that threatened crops. But then, something remarkable happened. People learned that even in its danger, this tree possessed power predictable, potent, and precise, and thus began humanity's long relationship with the alkaloid that would one day be called strychnine. The first chapter of this story takes us to ancient India. The Atharva Veda, compiled around 1200 BCE, mentions seeds with properties eerily consistent with nux vomica, bitter, punishing, capable of causing violent muscular rigidity. While scholars still debate the exact plant referenced, trade routes from the Indus region already connected to areas where the Strychnine family thrived. Ritual healers at the time experimented endlessly with bitter herbs, attempting to classify them by their effects. Some healed, some harmed. Nux vomica belonged solidly to the latter group. By the 4th century BCE, texts from early Ayurvedic practitioners, specifically those attributed to and Sasrut, included references to extraordinarily bitter seeds used in minuscule amounts to stimulate the body's inner fire. A poetic yet accurate description of strychnine's excitatory effects on the nervous system. These physicians lived in a world where the line between remedy and poison was thin, even thinner than we imagine. By the 2nd century BCE, Chinese healers encountered a related species, Strychnus ignateus, whose seeds known as St. Ignatius beans were traded through the Mekong corridor. In the classical medical compendium Shanong Ben Kaojing, certain bitter seeds were classified as hot, acrid, and violently reactive, used only when diluted and only under strict supervision. Physicians knew they could spark intense bodily reactions, but they did not yet understand why. However, archaeological evidence suggests deeper, older interactions. Clay pots excavated from sites near modern-day Vietnam, dated to around 500 BC, contain residue consistent with crushed strychnine seeds. This indicates that long before strychnine became a chemical entity, it was already woven into the rituals of hunting, conflict, and sometimes healing. For centuries, these encounters remained isolated, local, and controlled. The poison nut tree was a regional hazard, a regional tool, but history rarely allows power to remain contained. As maritime trade intensified between 500 CE and 1300 CE, the seeds began to travel farther. Arab traders navigating the Indian Ocean brought tales of the bitter nut that stiffens limbs. In the medical writings of Al-Kindi, the renowned 9th century polymath, there are cryptic notes describing substances that cause the muscles to lock as if in death's imitation. While he never names strychnine directly, the description aligns unmistakably with strychnine poisoning. But the seeds that carried the alkaloid were not yet the stars of scientific curiosity. They were exotic oddities, tucked into apothecary shops across Persia, Baghdad, and even Cairo as medieval physicians explored the boundaries of medicinal risk. Meanwhile, in the dense jungles of Sri Lanka, early hunters prepared a viscous poison by grinding the seeds with plant sap. When applied to arrow tips, the poison produced clean, kill-swift muscular convulsions followed by respiratory collapse. The exact mechanism would not be understood for another 1,000 years. Across Southeast Asia, from Indonesia to Burma, Salated tribes cultivated intricate knowledge of strychnine plants. Hunters in Borneo mixed the seeds with extracts from other plants to create symptom-specific poisons. Some slowed the heart, others induced paralysis. And the strychnine mixture caused an unmistakable stiffening of prey before collapse. But as centuries passed, new empires rose, trade expanded, and curiosity grew. But then, something changed. After thousands of years confined to forests, rituals, and limited medicinal use, the bitter seeds of Nux vomica entered a world undergoing seismic intellectual transformation. The 18th and 19th centuries were the age of the chemists, the age of laboratories, glassware, acids, solvents, and the belief that every plant contained a hidden blueprint waiting to be extracted. And the world would never be the same after strychnine revealed itself as one of the most powerful alkaloids ever discovered. The second chapter of this story reveals the moment when curiosity overcame caution. Tonight we move from the forests of Asia to the flickering candlelit laboratories of Europe, where scientists worked late into the night, grinding seeds, boiling extracts, and chasing invisible essences. It was here in the early 1800s that strychnine was reborn, no longer a mysterious botanical phenomenon, but a crystalline chemical force. Our journey begins in Paris in 1818, where two chemists Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Benham Caventure conducting innovative work on plant alkaloids. The two men were young, ambitious, and fascinated by the idea that plants contained discrete chemical entities responsible for their medicinal effects. Their experiments had already yielded remarkable discoveries: quinine and cinchonine from cinchona bark, caffeine from coffee beans. But they turned their attention next to Nux vomica seeds, which European apothecaries were already selling in crude powdered form. In their laboratory en Rue, Jacob, Pelletier, and Caventou crushed Nux vomica seeds into a gritty powder. The air would have been filled with the bitter, acrid scent of the plant's interior. They mixed the powder with alcohol, subjected it to solvents, purified it through repeated washings, and eventually obtained a crystalline white substance bitter beyond comprehension, almost luminous when placed near a flame. They had isolated strychnine. This achievement, published in 1818, electrified the scientific community. Strychnine was unlike other alkaloids. Even in microgram quantities, it produced violent physiological effects. Early tests on animals demonstrated its terrifying potency. A single crystal placed on a frog's tongue caused immediate convulsions. Dogs exposed to tiny doses collapsed into violent spasms, their muscles contracting with deadly precision. But at this early point in the chemical story, no one fully understood why strychnine acted this way. The mechanism behind its extreme toxicity remained invisible. Chemists knew how to isolate it. Physicians knew how to administer it, but only time would reveal its deeper secrets. Still, strychnine quickly became a subject of fascination and fear. Physicians viewed strychnine as a potential wonder drug. They believed its ability to stimulate nerves and muscles could treat paralysis, lethargy, digestive weakness, and even impotence. In France, doctors prescribed pills containing as little as 1/60th of a grain, just a few milligrams. In Germany, physicians dissolved strychnine into tinctures used to awaken what they called dormant nerves. One physician, Francois Magendie, published clinical notes describing the dramatic effects of strychnine ingestion in patients suffering from limb paralysis. Some regained limited movement. Others responded violently, their muscles contracting painfully. Magendie concluded with a single chilling observation: the line between remedy and death is thin indeed. As strychnine spread through European pharmacology, pharmacies began selling it in various forms: powders, pills, and tinctures diluted in alcohol. Advertisements claimed it invigorated the spine, improved digestion, and restored vital energy. Victorians loved stimulants: opium for calm, cocaine for clarity, strychnine for vigor. But strychnine had a shadow. While doctors experimented with it, toxicologists and criminals were discovering just how perfectly suited the substance was for darker purposes: easy to conceal, easy to administer, nearly impossible to detect with early forensic methods, and almost guaranteed to cause death by extreme muscular convulsion. By the 1830s, forensic scientists were scrambling to keep up with cases of suspected poisoning. But detection was still primitive. The famous toxicologist Matthew Orfila, known as the father of forensic toxicology, attempted to develop tests for strychnine. He succeeded partially, demonstrating that strychnine could sometimes be recovered from human organs after death, but the results were inconsistent. Strychnine's tendency to bind to tissues made it elusive. This elusiveness made the compound attractive to those who wished to commit murder undetected. Throughout the mid-19th century, court cases emerged across Europe, each involving mysterious deaths marked by violent convulsions. Strychnine poisoning followed a distinctive physiological pattern: sudden stiffness, painful arching of the back, lockjaw, uncontrollable spasms triggered by the slightest noise or touch, and finally respiratory arrest. Yet because these symptoms resembled tetanus, many physicians misdiagnosed victims, but the scientific world continued to probe deeper into the nature of the substance. In 1819, just a year after its isolation, Pelletier and Caventou published a detailed report describing strychnine's crystals under a primitive microscope. These crystals were needle-like, sharp, symmetrical, the visual representation of danger. And while these scientific advances unfolded, something else was occurring. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society, driving demand for a wide spectrum of chemicals. Factories were producing dyes, acids, and solvents in unprecedented quantities. Strychnine, too, began to be manufactured industrially. By the 1850s, Germany led the world in strychnine production, with pharmaceutical firms like Merck supplying the alkaloid globally. At this point, the world entered the era in which strychnine became both medicine and menace. But the story moves deeper still. Around the 1840s, scientific attention turned to the deeper pharmacological properties of strychnine. One figure stands out: Claude Bernard, the renowned French physiologist whose research helped establish the foundations of modern neuroscience. Bernard was fascinated by strychnine's ability to produce violent convulsions. He sought to understand the exact point of impact within the nervous system. His experiments on frogs, rabbits, and dogs revealed something extraordinary. Strychnine did not act on muscles directly. It acted on the spinal cord, specifically blocking inhibitory pathways. In simple terms, strychnine removed the body's natural brakes. Every stimulus, even a whisper of sound or a faint touch, triggered massive muscle contractions. Bernard's discovery was monumental. It showed that poisons could reveal secrets about the nervous system, secrets that no other method could uncover. Through strychnine, Bernard helped establish the principle that certain toxins target specific neural pathways. This insight laid the foundation for modern neuropharmacology. Yet as science advanced, crime adapted. Throughout the mid-19th century, strychnine became a favored tool of murderers, especially those seeking financial gain through inheritance or insurance fraud. One of the earliest documented cases occurred in 1845, when a London woman named Sarah Hart died after consuming a mixture of beer and cocoa that had been spiked with strychnine. Suspicion fell on a young man named John Tawell, who fled to London by train, a dramatic escape that triggered one of the first uses of telegraph technology in a criminal pursuit. Tawell was eventually arrested and convicted. The public was horrified not only by the death itself, but by the nature of the poison used: invisible, bitter, and agonizing. But not all deaths were investigated with such diligence. Many went unnoticed or misdiagnosed. Strychnine had become a shadow presence in Victorian society. As we move deeper into the second chapter, we enter the Victorian fascination with poisons as both scientific curiosities and cultural obsessions. In Britain, the 19th century was known as the poisoning century. Newspapers sensationalized murder trials involving arsenic, cyanide, and strychnine. Public fear grew, and authors like Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle absorbed this fear into their fiction. In Doyle's The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, a fictional poison resembling strychnine causes victims to die in terror. Dickens, in Bleak House, alluded to the use of toxic substances accessible to everyday people. But strychnine remained special. Its symptoms were so dramatic, so distinctive, that it became a symbol of ultimate agonizing death. The science, meanwhile, continued advancing. By the 1870s, chemical methods for identifying strychnine improved. The color testing, which sulfuric acid and a small amount of potassium dichromate caused strychnine to turn a vivid blue, allowed forensic chemists to detect even small quantities. Suddenly, strychnine murders became harder to hide. Detectives and coroners had a new weapon in their arsenal. But strychnine's appeal did not diminish. Instead, it shifted into new domains. During the late 19th century, athletes began taking microdoses of strychnine as a stimulant. Yes, strychnine became an early performance-enhancing drug. Marathon runners and cyclists used it to stave off fatigue and increase alertness. Physicians even endorsed its use, often combining it with brandy or caffeine. In the 1904 Olympic marathon, The American runner Thomas Hicks famously ingested strychnine administered by his trainers. He staggered across the finish line, barely alive, but victorious. He later said he remembered almost nothing of the final miles. Victorian sporting culture believed in pushing the human body to extremes. Strychnine seemed, at the time, like a scientific edgy way to unlock hidden reserves of energy. But the consequences of strychnine use were not always subtle. Athletes collapsed, convulsed, and suffered long-term neurological complications. Yet the compound's reputation as a stimulant persisted into the early 20th century. While athletes experimented with it, medical professionals continued prescribing strychnine as a general tonic. Advertisements proclaimed its benefits for digestion, depression, and weakness of the nerves. Strychnine-laced tonics were sold over the counter in Britain, the United States, and continental Europe. Some even marketed themselves as pick-me-up beverages. But the world was approaching a new era, an era of global upheaval, scientific breakthroughs, and darker uses of the alkaloid. Before moving forward, we pause to understand the compound's deeper cultural imprint. In Victorian literature and art, the fear of poison reflected broader anxieties: industrialization, urban anonymity, the fragility of domestic life. Strychnine became a symbol of hidden danger, the kind of threat that could sit quietly in a teacup. Meanwhile, medical journals debated the ethics of using a substance that so easily caused suffering. Some doctors argued that its benefits outweighed the risks. Others warned that even tiny miscalculations could be deadly. And as public fascination grew, governments began drafting laws to regulate the sale of dangerous poisons. The United Kingdom's Poisons Act of 1851 placed restrictions on arsenic, strychnine, morphine, and other potent substances. Apothecaries were required to label them clearly and record all purchases, but in practice, enforcement was uneven. By the 1880s, strychnine was found not only in pharmacies but also in rat poisons, vermin control powders, and agricultural supplies. This widespread availability made it almost impossible to fully regulate. As the world marched toward the 20th century, strychnine found itself at the crossroads of science, medicine, crime, and culture. But even more significant transformations were coming. Chemical analysis techniques continued to advance. Physiologists mapped strychnine's effects on inhibitory neurons. Pharmacologists debated its therapeutic thresholds. Meanwhile, societies worldwide confronted growing cases of accidental and deliberate poisonings. And then the world plunged into the 20th century, an age defined by war, mechanization, global trade, and scientific revolution. An age in which strychnine would appear in new contexts: warfare, medical kits, military contracts, criminal arsenals, and scientific research. But before darkness descends, there is one more turning point to explore. By the early 1900s, scientists finally identified strychnine's precise chemical structure. In 1910, the chemist Sir Robert Robinson began theoretical work that contributed to understanding the molecule S-complex fused ring structure. Later refinements by Sir Robert Woodward in the mid-20th century cemented our understanding of alkaloid chemistry. Strychnine wasn't just potent, it was chemically beautiful, symmetrical, intricate, and rigid. For generations of chemists, it became the ultimate challenge molecule, a puzzle that demanded intellectual mastery. But as chemists celebrated the molecule's architecture, the world was discovering how devastating its effects could be on the human body at scale. And now we stand on the threshold of the next act. The scientific age had elevated strychnine from obscure plant extract to global commodity. Crimes involving the substance were multiplying. Medical use was expanding but controversial. Forensic science was catching up, but not yet enough to deter determined killers. What happened next would shock the world as strychnine found itself entangled in wars, scandals, epidemics of poisoning, and stories of human agony that would define the 20th century. When you're ready, say continue, and we'll enter the next act, the era of crisis, violence, and strychnine's darkest consequences. The years that followed would push strychnine into a realm far beyond chemistry, far beyond medicine, and far beyond the controlled experiments of early scientists. As populations grew, cities expanded, and crime evolved. This bitter crystalline substance became a silent weapon, one that slipped into drinks, meals, medicines, and even political intrigues. What had once been a botanical curiosity transformed into one of the most feared poisons in human history. Strychnine's rise as an agent of violence was not an accident. It came from a perfect storm: easy access, delayed detection, brutal symptoms, and an eerie reliability. Anyone with malicious intent could acquire it under the guise of pest control. Anyone with a grudge could hide it behind everyday bitterness, coffee, beer, herbal tonics, even wine. And because strychnine was widely accepted as a legitimate agricultural substance, it rarely raised suspicion. This accessibility gave criminals the confidence to experiment, and in doing so, they left a trail of panic across continents. The 19th century, in particular, became a breeding ground for strychnine crimes. Courts across Europe and the United States saw cases that shocked entire communities. Husbands attempted to silence wives, business partners tried to eliminate rivals. Individuals battling debts turned to poison as a quick and quiet solution. Each case added to the public's fear, and newspapers eagerly printed every horrific detail. The violent spasms, the chilling grin, the desperate cries for help. The media, hungry for sensational stories, unintentionally turned strychnine into a cultural symbol of cruelty and stealth. But the greatest shift came when forensic science began catching up. Early toxicologists discovered how to detect strychnine in the human body, and suddenly, many mysterious deaths were revisited. What had been dismissed as cholera, tetanus, or seizures were now reclassified as homicides. Courtrooms filled with chemical testimonies, expert witnesses, and new scientific procedures. Strychnine was no longer just a poison. It became a tool that accelerated the evolution of forensic medicine itself. Yet the poison remained stubbornly attractive to criminals. Even as law enforcement improved, strychnine continued appearing in cases involving inheritance battles, insurance fraud, jealous lovers, and political conspiracies. Its dual identity, simple enough to obtain, horrifying enough to kill, ensured that it lingered in the shadows of society. And while these crimes unfolded, another crisis began to surface. Strychnine contamination. Poorly regulated markets, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sold fake medicines and tainted alcohol. Some unscrupulous manufacturers added strychnine to invigorating tonics and energy drinks. Others marketed it as a stimulant for athletes. In certain regions, entire communities suffered from poison-laced products that disguised themselves as harmless remedies. These events revealed a deeper truth. Strychnine's story is not just about criminals, victims, and scientists. It is about the fragile relationship between trust and danger. It is about how societies handle powerful substances, the beneficial and the lethal, and how easily that balance can shift. If this was the era of crisis, then what came next would be the era of transformation. The turning point in strychnine's long and violent history arrived when science finally learned to fight back. Before the late 1800s, poisoners thrived on one crucial fact. Most victims died without clear evidence. Doctors lacked the tools to distinguish natural convulsions from chemically induced ones, and coroners could not isolate foreign substances with precision. Strychnine's victims were buried quietly, their stories ending with speculation rather than certainty. But as the world entered the scientific age, a new force emerged. Forensic toxicology, a discipline born from the need to expose hidden killers, and few poisons shaped its evolution more dramatically than strychnine. Early forensic pioneers recognized a unique advantage. While strychnine caused sudden and chaotic symptoms, it left behind chemical fingerprints. Researchers developed extraction methods that could isolate the poison from tissues, even days or weeks after death. Laboratories refined crystallization tests, where telltale needle-shaped structures formed like tiny signatures of guilt. These breakthroughs made courtroom testimony more accurate, more believable, and far more dangerous for would-be poisoners. As forensic science strengthened, strychnine cases became some of the first trials where chemistry decided a person's fate. Judges, once skeptical of scientific intervention, began relying on lab results to convict murderers. Jurors listened as experts described how a few milligrams could paralyze a body, how the nervous system collapsed in a predictable pattern, and how these clues revealed the truth behind the crime. Each successful prosecution sent a clear message. Poisoners could no longer hide behind uncertainty. Strychnine also reshaped investigative strategy. Detectives learned to look for subtle signs: bitterness in a drink, missing pest control powder, sudden personality changes in victims, or suspicious life insurance policies. Hospitals trained physicians to recognize the poison's unique progression: anxiety, muscle stiffness, hyper-awareness, and the dreaded convulsions triggered by even the slightest sound. These patterns allowed doctors to intervene faster and prevented countless deaths that would have once been unavoidable. But strychnine's influence extended beyond the morgue and the courtroom. It became a catalyst for protecting consumers on a massive scale. Governments introduced stricter regulations on agricultural poisons. Pharmacies adopted secure storage procedures. Factories faced inspections to ensure that no stimulant, tonic, or supplement contained hidden toxins. Even labeling laws changed, requiring clearer warnings and more transparent ingredient lists. The evolution of forensic intelligence marked the beginning of strychnine's decline as a murder weapon. Criminals, rattled by the growing certainty of detection, abandoned it for less traceable methods. Society had finally gained an upper hand, though the poison's legacy would never disappear entirely. It remained an object of fear, fascination, and study. Appearing in literature, crime fiction, and medical education long after its reign of terror waned. What this era proved was simple. Every crisis creates innovation, And in the case of strychnine, the very substance that once empowered murderers ultimately strengthened the scientific institutions that protect us today. If the birth of forensic toxicology represented transformation, the next act reveals how strychnine stepped into the world of sports, performance culture, and dangerous self-experimentation. A chapter as surprising as it is unsettling. Just when strychnine seemed destined to be remembered only as a murder weapon and forensic milestone, it re-emerged in a realm no one expected: sports. At the turn of the 20th century, competitive athletics were transforming into global spectacles, and athletes pushed their bodies to extreme limits. Modern sports science didn't exist yet, but ambition did. And in that vacuum of guidance, coaches and competitors turned to anything that promised an advantage, even poisons. Strychnine, with its stimulant-like effects at extremely low doses, slipped into this world almost naturally. Early physiologists believed small quantities could sharpen reflexes, delay fatigue, and heighten muscular performance. These effects were misinterpreted as strength-enhancing when, in reality, they were the early tremors of toxicity. But without detailed research or medical oversight, athletes embraced the myth. The most infamous example came during the 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis, one of the most chaotic and dangerous races in modern history. In the stifling heat amid dust, dehydration, and minimal medical support, runner Thomas Hicks became a dark legend. Struggling near collapse, his handlers administered a mixture of raw egg whites, brandy, and 2 doses of strychnine sulfate. They believed it would revitalize him, acting as a performance enhancer. Instead, it pushed his body into survival mode, pallor, trembling, and semi-delirium. Yet Hicks staggered forward, driven partly by willpower and partly by the poison coursing through him. When he crossed the finish line, he was barely conscious, requiring immediate treatment to avoid death. That moment shocked both the sporting world and the medical community. The near-fatal experiment showed how easily ambition could blur into recklessness. Still, the belief in strychnine as a stimulant persisted for decades, especially in endurance sports. Cyclists, marathoners, and even swimmers used it under the misguided notion that tiny doses were safe. Trainers experimented with increasingly precise amounts, trying to find a threshold that boosted energy without triggering convulsions. It was a dangerous balancing act, one miscalculation away from catastrophe. What made this era alarming wasn't just the use of strychnine, but the lack of oversight. No standardized rules existed, no doping tests, no medical ethics committees. Athletes essentially served as human experiments, guided by folklore, desperation, and the competitive hunger to outperform rivals. As sports grew more professional and physicians gained influence in athletic training, the reality became impossible to ignore. Strychnine did not enhance performance, it endangered life. Doctors documented cases of arrhythmia, nervous system strain, and severe poisoning in competitors who believed they were taking harmless boosters. The substance transitioned from a whispered secret to a banned stimulant as early anti-doping policies emerged. By the mid-20th century, strychnine was officially recognized as a performance-enhancing drug, not because it worked, but because its risks were devastating. Regulatory bodies removed it from sports entirely. Athletes who once relied on dangerous shortcuts began turning toward nutrition, conditioning, and legitimate medical science. Yet this chapter remains a striking reminder of how deeply a substance can weave itself into human culture. From medicine to murder, from crime to competition, strychnine kept evolving through the motivations of the people who used it: fear, greed, ambition, ignorance, and hope. Now that strychnine's journey through sports has been uncovered, it's time to explore the next territory where the poison left a lasting imprint: literature, psychology, and the cultural imagination. Before we step into the modern scientific era, we must pause in the realm where strychnine found an unexpected kind of immortality: the world of stories. Because while the chemical itself is bitter, colorless, and brutally efficient, its cultural shadow is far more complex. Tonight, we trace that shadow through novels, plays, newspaper headlines, and whispered fears that shaped the public imagination for more than a century. Strychnine entered literature almost as soon as it entered medicine. Victorian and Edwardian writers, fascinated by the tension between scientific progress and moral decay, seized upon it as a perfect symbol: invisible, fast-acting, and associated with death that looked eerily like life fighting to escape its own body. Authors used it to explore greed, jealousy, power, and betrayal. In many stories, strychnine wasn't merely a poison, it was a metaphor for hidden malice. One of the earliest and most influential literary uses came from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who understood both the chemical and psychological impact of poison. In The Sign of 4, Sherlock Holmes mentions strychnine as part of a case, calling it one of the deadliest of all vegetable alkaloids, a phrase that would echo in countless later works. Mystery writers embraced it because strychnine killings created dramatic, horrifying scenes. contorted limbs, rigid muscles, a victim frozen in an agonizing final arch. It was physically distinctive, terrifying, and unmistakably intentional, exactly the kind of imagery that fuels suspense. But literature did more than dramatize strychnine. It amplified fear. Newspapers from the late 1800s onward published sensational accounts of strychnine fiends, devil's drug murders, and silent killers in the pantry. These headlines often exaggerated the facts, yet they cemented the poison's reputation. Everyday readers, unfamiliar with chemistry but familiar with human frailty, found themselves staring at a word that sounded almost serpentine. It became a cultural shorthand for wickedness disguised as science. Strychnine gained a peculiar presence in popular media as well. In the early 20th century, it surfaced in silent films, radio plays, and noir cinema as a tool of espionage and betrayal. Filmmakers were captivated by the theatrical nature of its effects, the dramatic convulsions, the tension-filled final moments. Even when fictionalized, these portrayals painted strychnine as a substance designed for narrative impact. It fueled villains, tragedies, and moral warnings across genres. The poison also took root in psychology, not just as a neurological stimulant, but as a trigger of collective fear. Human beings are uniquely afraid of things we cannot see or smell. Strychnine's invisibility made it more frightening than weapons or visible dangers. Psychologists studying early 20th century anxieties noted that poisons represented betrayal, harm from someone trusted, someone close, someone who knew you well enough to access your food, your drink, your home. A gun could be defended against, a blade could be seen. But a pinch of bitter powder stirred silently into a meal symbolized a more intimate form of danger. It fueled the fear of the unseen. Artists, too, wrestled with strychnine's symbolic weight. Painters used it as inspiration for works depicting the struggle between life and death, tension and collapse. Poets referenced it as a metaphor for emotional torment, hidden pain, or the sudden eruption of suppressed anger. In the dark undercurrent of cultural imagination, strychnine became more than a chemical. It became a story about human vulnerability. However, this era of mythmaking also distorted public understanding. Many people believed strychnine killed instantly. It didn't. Many believed it was flavorless. It wasn't. Others imagined it as the most lethal poison known to man. Also untrue. But myths persist because they resonate emotionally, not because they reflect the facts. And strychnine, with its dramatic symptoms and agonizing death, resonated deeply. By the mid-20th century, its image had fully crystallized. To writers, it was narrative fuel. To the public, it was a symbol of treachery. To scientists, it was a neurological key. To criminals, it was a weapon. And to those who feared it, which was nearly everyone, it represented the darkest possibilities of human intent. Now, as we leave the realm of story and symbolism, our narrative returns to science, the slow, methodical unraveling of strychnine's mysteries. With each passing decade, laboratories grew more advanced, regulations tighter, and medical ethics stronger. Yet even as the world changed, the legacy of this alkaloid continued to ripple outward. If you're still awake, let your mind settle deeper as we turn to the next chapter, a more technical yet equally haunting journey. The 20th century brought with it unprecedented advances in chemistry, pharmacology, and toxicology. Epidemiologists and toxicologists compiled statistics, accidental deaths, attempted murders, and cases of occupational exposure. While once ubiquitous, it had been largely replaced by other, more discreet methods of homicide. Yet the medical literature continued to document its lethality, ensuring that knowledge persisted for future generations. University toxicology courses still used strychnine as a model for studying convulsive poisons. Strychnine's reputation as a dangerous chemical shifted. Aligning with a broader global consensus, its benefits were outweighed by its risks. In laboratory settings, it required strict handling protocols. And in forensic investigation, the alkaloid continued to serve as a benchmark for analytical chemistry, helping to train generations of toxicologists. Today, strychnine is no longer a household name. Yet its presence lingers in the shadows of modern science, law, and culture. It is tightly regulated across the globe, classified as a controlled substance in nearly every country. In the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency monitors its use strictly as a rodent. In Europe, the European Chemicals Agency enforces precise labeling, dosage restrictions, and mandatory reporting for any accidental exposure. Even in agriculture, the substance is used sparingly, replaced largely by safer alternatives. The public rarely encounters strychnine directly, yet its history informs contemporary chemical policy, forensic methodology, and neurological research. Despite strict regulation, strychnine continues to feature in medical and scientific literature. Researchers study its interactions with the central nervous system to understand inhibitory neurotransmission, spinal reflexes, and neuromuscular coordination. Its effects on glycine receptors remain a reference point for pharmacologists and neuroscientists, particularly in modeling convulsive disorders or testing neuroprotective compounds. In this way, the poison that once sparked fear now contributes to life-saving knowledge. Modern forensic toxicology has reached unprecedented precision. Analytical tools such as high-performance liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry allow for the detection of strychnine at microgram levels in blood, urine, and tissue. Cases of suspected poisoning, though rare, are immediately traceable, and law enforcement can act before harm escalates. Historical tragedies have been converted into procedural templates, shaping protocols for handling all toxic substances. Yet the cultural and psychological imprint of strychnine persists. It remains a motif in crime fiction, psychological thrillers, and cinematic portrayals of murder and betrayal. Its name evokes dread and intrigue, reminding us that certain chemicals carry stories far beyond their molecular composition. In classrooms and laboratories, students learn its history as a cautionary tale, a bitter reminder that human ambition, curiosity, and negligence can transform a natural compound into a tool of suffering. Even in the 21st century, strychnine occasionally surfaces in forensic case studies, sometimes as an accidental contaminant in rodenticides or herbal supplements. These instances highlight the enduring importance of regulation, education, and awareness. The alkaloids' legacy is not just one of pain and tragedy, but of progress, the development of forensic science, legal oversight, and scientific ethics. As we look across nations from rural villages in Bangladesh to the laboratory benches of Europe and the agricultural fields of North America, the story of strychnine unites themes of human ingenuity, error, and resilience. It reminds us that a single molecule, however small, can shape law, literature, medicine, and morality across centuries. Today, we still grapple with the legacy of strychnine. It is a molecule of paradox, simultaneously destructive and enlightening, feared yet instructive. It teaches us about mortality, the consequences of unchecked ambition, and the importance of vigilance in scientific and societal endeavors. In classrooms, laboratories, and even in popular media, it serves as a bridge between past and present, illustrating both our vulnerabilities and our capacity for progress. The contemporary period then is less about active danger and more about reflection, an era in which we interpret the lessons strychnine has left us, ensuring that knowledge, oversight, and caution prevail over ignorance and recklessness.